The bedsheet is cool against your wrist, and somewhere beyond the blanket you hear it. A tiny click on the floor. Then silence. Then the faintest brush of fur against the side of the bed. The room is dark enough that edges have gone soft, and if you are already half asleep, you might only notice the warmth a moment later. A small body choosing a place near your legs. A soft, rhythmic purr beginning low and steady in the dark. For you, it is only a quiet night. A familiar creature has come close, settled down, and claimed a corner of your rest as if it has always belonged there. And in a way, it has. Because the animal beside you carries a story so old that it reaches back beyond your home, beyond your language, beyond the first towns most people could name. If you want, you can let your breathing slow now. You do not have to hold every detail tightly. This is one of those histories that can drift around you like warm air, and still find its way in. The strange part, the part that changes everything, is this. The cat beside you was never shaped by human hands in the same way dogs, horses, or cattle were. We did not take some wild thing and patiently remake its body and mind until it fit us. The deeper truth of the 12,000-year history of cats and self-domestication is quieter than that, and honestly, more astonishing. They came near because it suited them. They found a place we had accidentally built, stepped into it on their own terms, and stayed. Not as servants, not as conquered animals, but as hunters who discovered that human life had become useful. You can still see that old hunter if you know where to look. In the way a house cat goes completely still before it moves. In the way its ears turn before its body does. In those amber eyes in the dark, catching the smallest change in light. Under the softness, under the purring, under all the comfort of cushions and windowsills, the design is still there. Elegant, efficient, almost untouched. And that matters, because it tells you this story is about a meeting. A long one. 12,000 years long, if you stretch your view wide enough. Their line leads back to the Near East, to the African wildcat, Felis silvestris lybica. Not the European wildcat, not the Asian lineages. That particular animal, wary, solitary, alert, stands at the root of the companion curled in the dark near your feet. And once you know that, the whole history feels different. Suddenly the modern cat is a survivor from the beginning of a bargain. But even bargains need a first moment, a first risk, a first evening when one living thing watched another and did not run. So before temples, before ships, before homes with lamps in the windows, we have to go back to a harder and emptier world. A world where people had not yet built the kind of place a wildcat would ever want to approach. A world before grain was stored, before mice gathered in unnatural numbers, before the first Fertile Crescent granaries changed the relationship forever. If you enjoy these long, sleepy journeys through forgotten history, you can subscribe and stay for the next chapter. Because the whole story may have begun with nothing more dramatic than one wild creature standing just beyond firelight, deciding whether to take one step closer. And to understand that first step, you have to strip away the blanket, the lamp, the window, the quiet room, and look instead at the body of the creature itself. Even now, in a warm house, it carries the shape of a dusk hunter. The shoulders rise and fall with a kind of liquid care. The paws land softly, almost without sound. The ears swivel before the head turns. And when it pauses, really pauses, there is nothing lazy in it. The stillness is work. The body is measuring distance, air, movement, timing. If you have ever watched a cat freeze at the edge of a hallway, eyes fixed on something you cannot even see, then you have already watched a very old design at work. That design matters because it tells you where the story begins. It begins before any pet shop, any breeding plan, any human hand deciding what the animal should become. The line behind the house cat leads back to Felis silvestris lybica, the African wildcat of the Near East, rather than the heavier wildcats of Europe or the Asian branches. This particular hunter is the one that matters here. Lean, alert, solitary, built for dry ground, scrub, reeds, and the long patience of waiting. You can almost feel the coarse grass against its legs, the powder of dust on its paws, the cool air of evening settling over stone. And this is where the story becomes even more surprising, because that ancestor was not social in the way many people imagine. It did not go looking for company. It did not need a group to hunt. It did not survive by pleasing anything larger than itself. It lived by caution, by distance, by choosing the right moment and refusing the wrong one. So if you ever want proof that this bond between us and them is unusual, there it is. The earliest cat was no eager partner waiting to be invited in. It was a creature that preferred not to be noticed at all. You can rest with that thought for a moment if you like. It softens the whole history in a strange way. Because once you understand what that wild cat was, the modern cat begins to seem less like something we created and more like something that tolerated us, gradually, because a new opportunity appeared. The tale is not about a proud beast being broken. It is about a careful one changing its mind. Before that change, though, there was a long age when there was no reason to come closer. Humans moved often, camps shifted, food did not sit in one place for very long. A roaming people could not create the kind of rich feeding ground that would tempt a hunter to risk human scent and human noise. There was no steady attraction yet, no repeating reward, no pattern strong enough to overcome fear. So the two species remained mostly separate, one sleeping by embers and waking with the light, the other moving through reeds and stone at the hour when the day cooled and tiny animals rustled in the dark. Their paths might cross, yes, but crossing is not the same as joining. A glance is not a bond. A footprint near a camp is not a partnership. Something had to change in the land first. The change was not in the cat's bones, eyes, or the old machinery of the hunt. The world around it had to become different enough to make risk worthwhile. And when that happened, it did not happen with a collar or a command. It happened with grain, with storage, with the smell of dry seed gathered in one place, with the first Fertile Crescent granaries, and with the sudden, irresistible sound those places made after dark. And grain changes everything, even before anyone understands that it has. You can picture those early store places by their texture more than their shape. Baskets rough against the hand, seed husks underfoot, dust hanging in warm air, a dry smell that lingers on skin and cloth. Once people in the Fertile Crescent began staying put and keeping food in one place, the night itself sounded different. There would have been faint scratching in the walls, quick little feet in the straw, tiny teeth testing woven fiber and mud seams. Stored grain was not just food for human beings. It was a bright signal to every small raider in the dark that a feast had appeared. And even better, that it would still be there tomorrow. And where those animals gathered, the hunter did not need an invitation. It only needed to notice the pattern. This is the moment people often misunderstand. They imagine a person seeing a charming kitten and deciding to tame it. But that is far too neat and much less interesting than what probably happened. The deeper truth is closer to simple opportunity. A few of those Near Eastern wildcats, the less fearful ones, discovered that the edge of a settlement was richer than open country. Not safer exactly. Human scent, fire, noise, dogs if any were nearby, sudden movement, all of that meant risk. But the reward was enormous. In the wild, a hunt could fail. Near stores of grain, prey kept coming back, again and again, night after night. So the first relationship was geometry, distance, timing. A creature staying just far enough away to survive, but close enough to profit. If you let yourself sink into that picture, you can almost see one of them at dusk, not inside the camp yet. It waits where the light thins out, among reeds, beside stone, under a broken line of scrub. It can smell old ash from cook fires. It can hear people settling, voices lowering, tools set down for the night. Beneath all that, there is the better sound, the small, nervous rush of rodents, moving through stored food they believe belongs to no one. For a hunter like this, the settlement has become a machine that gathers prey. Humans built it for themselves, but the cat reads it another way. And that is why self-domestication begins so quietly. Nobody had to capture a dozen wildcats and breed them for obedience. Nobody sat down with a grand plan to change their bodies or soften their instincts. The environment did the selecting. The animals that could tolerate human nearness without fleeing at once gained access to this rich new hunting ground. They ate better, they likely raised more young, and those young inherited not a love of people exactly, but a slightly greater calm around them. Just enough. A little less panic. A little more patience at the edge of the firelight. On the human side, something subtle was happening too. People would have noticed fewer gnawed stores where these hunters lingered. They may not have welcomed them warmly at first. A sudden movement from the shadows still startles. Amber eyes in the dark are not instantly comforting the first time you see them. But a creature that keeps rats and mice away becomes easier to tolerate. Then familiar. Then useful. And usefulness has a way of opening the door that emotion walks through later. Still, usefulness alone does not explain what comes next, because one thing is allowing a wild hunter to pass near your grain at night. Another thing entirely is carrying that animal with you, over water, to a place where it did not live before, and laying it down beside a human body in death. That kind of closeness leaves a trace. And thousands of years later, in Cyprus, one quiet burial would whisper that the bargain had already become something more. That whisper from Cyprus is one of the most moving traces in the whole story. Not because it is loud, dramatic, or covered in gold, but because it is so quiet. At Shillourokambos on Cyprus, people found a human and a cat buried in deliberate closeness, and the burial is roughly 9,500 years old. If you let yourself pause there for a second, the meaning settles in slowly, like dust in still air. This was beyond a passing shadow near a grain store. This was beyond a hunter seen once at the edge of camp and forgotten by morning. By the time that burial was made, the bond had already deepened enough that people carried the animal across water to an island where it did not belong on its own. And that changes the feeling of everything that came before. Imagine the small, practical effort behind that act. A living cat on a journey is not a pot or a tool. It moves, it startles, it hides, it needs watching. For people to bring one to Cyprus, there had to be a reason strong enough to justify the trouble. Perhaps it was valued for what it did around stores of food. Perhaps it had already become a familiar presence around sleeping places and work areas. Perhaps both things were true at once, as they so often are with this creature. Usefulness first, then attachment growing quietly around it, until one day nobody can quite say where one ended and the other began. That is one of the tender secrets inside the 12,000-year history of cats and self-domestication. The relationship did not announce itself with a ceremony. It gathered by repetition. One night hunt near a store place. One season with fewer pests. One animal seen again and again, no longer just a flash of movement, but a known presence. A shape that passed near the same wall at dusk. A body curled in the same dry corner when morning cooled. Familiarity, then trust. Never complete, but enough for distance to shrink. And still, even in this closeness, the old nature remained. That is what makes the whole bond so unusual. A dog altered itself more openly around us. A grazing animal could be fenced, bred, directed. But this one kept a piece of dusk inside it. It stayed light on the ground. It kept its own timing. It came near without fully surrendering. The cat of Shillourokambos was already part of human life, yes, yet it was also still the descendant of that solitary hunter from the Near East, carrying all the old caution in its bones. You can almost picture how that looked in daily life. A tolerated little guardian, moving through the spaces between human routines. No pet in the modern sense, no ornament. It slips along a wall while people work. It vanishes when noise rises. It reappears when the light softens and the rodents begin their own careful movements. No speech between species, not in our sense. No leash, no command. Just a pattern, repeated so many times that it becomes a shared world. And once a creature enters your shared world, your imagination begins to change around it. You start to notice how it watches, how it waits, how it can be both gentle and lethal, both near and unknowable. You stop seeing only a useful hunter. You begin seeing a presence, a temperament, something with its own gravity, something that belongs to the house and yet never quite belongs to you. That shift would matter enormously later. Because in one great river civilization, people were going to look at this animal, its stillness, its vigilance, its night vision, its care for its young, and see far more than a mouser. They were going to see a sacred shape hiding inside an ordinary body. And that is exactly what happened. Somewhere along the Nile, people looked at the same little hunter that had once waited beyond grain stores and began to read more into it than appetite and sharp reflexes. You can understand why. This creature moved through twilight as if it belonged to two worlds at once. It could lie folded in stillness for hours, then strike with impossible speed. It could be tender with its young and utterly precise with prey. In torchlight, its gaze seemed almost unnatural, bright, steady, unreadable. A small animal, yes, but one that carried itself with a kind of private authority. For a household, that mattered in simple ways first. A cat near stored food meant fewer intruders in the night. A cat near sleeping places meant one more layer of protection between human life and the things that crept, chewed, spoiled, and spread fear in the dark. But usefulness rarely stays plain for long. Human beings tell stories around whatever guards them, frightens them, or fascinates them. And this animal did all three. So over time in Egypt, it began to gather a meaning larger than its size. You can almost picture the change in slow motion. At first, perhaps, it is only noticed, then tolerated, then welcomed, then admired. A hunter who keeps to itself is already halfway to being mysterious. Add the eyes, the night movement, the grace, the quiet confidence, and suddenly, people are not only living with cats, they are watching them, thinking about them, putting them into art, into symbols, into the deeper language people use when they are trying to describe order, danger, motherhood, protection, and the strange border between home and wildness. This is one of the reasons the story feels so different from that of many other domestic animals. A cow can be valuable, a horse can be powerful, a dog can be loyal, but the cat kept something harder to explain. It never stopped seeming slightly self-possessed, as though it had agreed to share our rooms without ever forgetting it had other options. That made reverence possible. Not guaranteed, of course, but possible. You do not build sacred meaning around a creature that seems entirely broken to human will. You build it around one that appears complete in itself. And so, the relationship deepened in a new direction. Practical now, emotional, symbolic, almost spiritual. The same animal from the old settlement edges could now rest much nearer human life, near baskets, near sleeping mats, near hands. It was no longer only a useful night worker passing by. It had entered the inner atmosphere of the home. Its presence changed the feeling of a room. Its absence was noticed. If you are listening with a cat somewhere near you now, this part may feel oddly familiar, because even today they alter space without doing very much at all. A windowsill becomes occupied territory, a chair becomes a chosen throne, a corner becomes safe because they have decided it is safe. That silent authority is ancient. Egypt did not invent it. Egypt recognized it. But reverence brings another kind of change. Once people begin to value a creature deeply, they do not always keep it to themselves. Traders notice, travelers notice, neighbors notice. An animal that protects stores on land can protect stores at sea just as well, maybe better. And once that idea takes hold, the world opens under its paws. So while some cats were being folded into sacred images and household affection, others were being looked at by people with ships, cargo, rope, wood, and a very practical problem below deck. Because grain was not only stored in villages anymore, it was moving. And wherever it moved, the hunter's invitation moved with it. And once grain began to travel by water, the cat's old talent found a new stage. A boat loaded with food has its own smell. Dry seed, rope fibers, damp wood, old river water, mud on sandals, a little fish, a little smoke. And below all of that, in the hidden corners, comes the restless life that stored food always attracts. A floating cargo hold is only a moving version of the same promise that once rose from the first village stores. If rodents could find their way into baskets and bins on land, they could find their way into them on boats as well. The hunter did not need to understand trade routes or distant markets. It only needed to understand that where food gathered, prey gathered too. So the old bargain stretched itself across the water. You can imagine the scene without forcing it. A cat is not standing proudly at the front of a vessel like some heroic figure in a painting. It is moving where cats always move best. Along edges, through shadows, under benches, between jars, near the places where people do not look very often, but where tiny intruders certainly do. A ship is noisy, cramped, rocking, full of strange smells, a hard place for a cautious creature. And yet, this one had already been shaped by closeness to humans without belonging to them completely. That is why the pattern of self-domestication mattered so much. The same animal that could live near a home without surrendering its instincts could also live near cargo without needing to be commanded. And that made it valuable in a new way. On land, it helped protect stores in one place. On water, it protected movement itself. Grain, cloth, dried goods, anything vulnerable to gnawing teeth became safer if a cat lived among it. Not perfectly safe, of course. No living partnership is that tidy, but safer, and often safer in the quietest possible way. Many mornings, the sign of its work would be what was missing. Less damage, less spoilage, fewer traces of tiny bodies where people did not want them. This is how the creature kept making itself indispensable, by solving a problem. And once an animal becomes useful on the move, its world widens very quickly. That widening matters more than it may seem. A settlement bond is intimate but limited. A traveling bond multiplies. One landing place becomes several. One shoreline becomes another. One group of people sees the hunter at work, then carries the idea onward. The creature that first hovered near human stores in the Near East is now no longer tied to a single landscape. It can slip into harbors, docks, warehouses, riverbanks, boatyards, every place where food pauses, every place where people stack what they hope to keep. In a sense, the story is still repeating the same first scene. Human beings create a concentrated source of prey. The cat notices. It tolerates our presence just enough to benefit. We tolerate its distance because it benefits us too. Again and again, the pattern holds. Same animal, same instincts, a larger map. And yet, there is another change happening under the surface. When a creature travels with you, even for practical reasons, it begins to enter your idea of company. Not friendship in the modern sentimental sense, not yet, but presence, routine, recognition. Someone on board knows where it sleeps. Someone notices if it has not appeared by dusk. Someone has seen it pause in lamplight, then vanish below deck on silent pause. The old settlement familiarity returns in motion, and motion gives it reach. Soon, this animal will step off boats into new harbors and new homes, where different people will read it in different ways. Useful, elegant, unsettling, beloved. Because once a cat stops belonging to one river world and starts belonging to roots, it no longer travels through history. It begins to spread through imagination. And imagination can be as important as food in deciding the fate of an animal. Once cats began stepping off boats and into new settlements, people did not all see the same thing when they looked at them. Some saw a practical little hunter, perfect for storehouses and corners where grain waited. Some saw beauty, the clean line of the back, the quiet feet, the way the tail balanced every turn. Some saw mystery. That mattered more than it may sound, because the creature arriving from riverbanks and cargo holds was not blank in human eyes. It invited interpretation. It made people feel watched, protected, charmed, or unsettled, depending on what kind of world they lived in. You can feel how that would happen. A cat does not announce its mood the way many animals do. It can sit near you and still seem elsewhere. It can sleep in full trust, then wake in an instant, already alert. It chooses when to approach. It chooses when to leave. That independence is one of the deepest signatures of its history. It came from self-domestication, not surrender, and even people who had no words for that would have sensed it. This was an animal sharing their space without ever seeming entirely owned by it. That quality helped it fit into homes in a very particular way. Around the edges of human life at first. Near doorways, along walls, beside baskets, under benches, in patches of sun. A cat could belong to a household without demanding that the household revolve around it. It worked while appearing to do almost nothing. It learned the routines of the place. It knew where food was stored, where rodents passed, where warmth collected at dusk. And slowly, almost invisibly, people began to include it in their sense of what a proper home felt like. That is a powerful kind of success. Many animals can be useful. Fewer can become atmospheric. A cat changes the mood of a place. A quiet room with one curled in the corner does not feel the same as a quiet room without one. The same was likely true long before soft cushions and fireplaces. A storehouse with a resident hunter felt more secure. A sleeping place with that alert little body nearby felt less exposed. You did not need to pet it, name it, or fully trust it for its presence to matter. And because it mattered, it kept moving. Each new harbor, each new riverside stop, each new settlement gave the animal another chance to repeat the oldest pattern of all. Find the food, find the prey, endure the people, become tolerated, then valued. It is such a simple cycle that you might miss how extraordinary it is. Very few creatures have entered human civilization in such a light-footed way. No armies, no herds, no cages at the center of the process, just one cautious hunter after another, selecting us when it made sense. You might say the cat spread not by conquest, but by relevance. Still, relevance alone does not guarantee love. A creature can be useful and never cherished. It can be present and never welcomed deeply. So the real question, as this long chronicle moves forward, is how far the cat traveled and how close it came. At what point did people stop seeing a helpful shadow and start seeing a companion? At what point did the animal's silence begin to feel comforting instead of merely strange? Those answers would not arrive everywhere at once. In some places, admiration would grow. In others, suspicion would take root. The same poised body, the same night vision, the same almost unreadable face could inspire devotion in one age and fear in another. And that darker turn was waiting, even as the creature padded calmly through storerooms and sleeping quarters, unaware that human imagination can bless a thing and then suddenly decide to fear it. And that fear did not come from any change in the animal itself. The body was still the same one that had once lingered near grain and cargo, compact, patient, silent, built for narrow spaces and low light. The eyes still caught the last scraps of evening. The paws still made almost no sound. The cat had not turned into anything darker than it had always been. What changed was the story human beings wrapped around those features. In one household, a creature that wakes at the faintest rustle can feel like a guardian. In another, that same alertness can feel uncanny. In one village, a hunter slipping through shadows is a comfort. In another, the very same movement can unsettle people who want everything in their world to behave in a more obvious, more obedient way. That is a quiet tension running through the whole 12,000-year history of cats and self-domestication. The creature remained remarkably stable, while our interpretations of it swung back and forth like a door in shifting wind. We liked what it did for us, but we were never entirely sure what to make of what it was. A dog announces devotion. A grazing animal submits to fences. A cat keeps part of itself hidden, even in plain sight. It comes close, but on its own terms. It rests, but never fully lets go of awareness. It can be deeply at ease in a human room and still look, for one brief moment, like a visitor from somewhere older than the room itself. You probably know that feeling already, even now. A cat can be asleep in a patch of sunlight one second, then standing, fully alert, the next, as if some invisible thread inside it has been pulled tight. That quick transformation is beautiful, but it can also make people uneasy when they do not understand it. If you live in a calm and practical frame of mind, you see a hunter's reflexes. If you live in a fearful one, you may start to imagine meanings that were never there. The same face that looked dignified yesterday can look unreadable today. The same gaze that felt protective can feel watchful in the wrong kind of story. and people are always making stories. So as cats spread farther through homes, store places, and moving routes, they gathered not only affection, but projections. Some people drew them inward, closer to the center of domestic life. Others kept them at the threshold, useful but not fully trusted. Some would have noticed the soothing side of their company long before they had language for it. A warm body nearby, a settled room, a familiar shape returning at dusk. Others would have noticed only their refusal to behave like animals made entirely for human command. It is a small difference in attention, but over generations it can become enormous. Because when an animal turns symbolic, it stops being judged only by what it actually does. It starts being judged by what people fear at night, what they hope a home can protect, what they think independence means, what they think silence means, what they think eyes in dim light must be seeing. A cat never needed to change shape for that to happen. Human beings could do all the changing by themselves, simply by deciding what meaning to pour into the same poised little body. And yet, through all of that, the creature kept doing what it had always done. It kept hunting where prey gathered. It kept sleeping where warmth collected. It kept drifting in and out of human space with that same measured confidence. Which means the next turn in this history will not begin in the cat at all. It will begin in the human home, when usefulness slowly gives way to something softer, stranger, and much more personal. And that softer change began in the smallest places, not in grand halls first, and not in formal declarations, but in the ordinary rhythm of a shared shelter. A cat learns the warm spots long before anyone writes poetry about it. It finds the ledge where the late sun stays longest. It circles once on a folded cloth. It slips beneath a bench when voices rise, then returns when evening cools the air. And if it is hunted well, if the grain is less threatened and the sleeping place feels calmer, then the people around it begin to change their habits too. They stop treating it as a passing shadow. They begin leaving space. That may not sound like much, but leaving space is an early sign of affection. A space near the doorway that is not swept too sharply. A corner by stored food that no one disturbs if the cat is resting there. A brief glance at dusk to see whether it has returned. The relationship becomes domestic before it becomes sentimental. It is built from repeated, practical mercy. Nobody needs to say, "This creature belongs with us." The body language of the household says it first. The animal is no longer merely tolerated for its usefulness. It has become part of the pattern of the place. And once that happens, the home begins to hold two kinds of safety at once. There is the obvious safety: fewer rodents, less spoilage, less movement in the dark where food is kept. But there is also a quieter kind. The sight of a calm hunter at rest tells you something about the room itself. If the cat is stretched out, if it has tucked its paws under and gone still, then the place must be settled enough for vigilance to soften. Long before anyone studied animal behavior, people would have sensed this instinctively. A resting cat changes how a room feels. It lends borrowed calm. You may know that feeling in your own home now. A chair with a sleeping cat in it seems warmer than the same chair empty. A hallway feels less lonely if something living has chosen to wait there. The animal does not have to perform affection in a human way for its presence to feel intimate. In fact, that may be part of the magic. It is near you without becoming a mirror of you. It keeps its own nature, and yet shares its stillness. This is where the story grows more emotionally interesting than a simple tale of pest control. A dog may offer obvious loyalty. A horse may show training and trust. But this creature gives something subtler. It gives permission into its space in fragments. a little nearness, a little relaxation. A body no longer ready to flee at every sound. Those are small gifts from an animal descended from Felis, silvestris, lybica. And perhaps that is why they feel so meaningful. Nothing about them is automatic. Every bit of closeness feels chosen. That chosen quality may be the real foundation of the bond. Because once a cat begins to stay not only near food, but near people, the relationship stops being purely economic. It becomes emotional in ways neither side would have planned. The home gains atmosphere, not just protection. The animal gains warmth, not just prey. A cycle of benefit becomes a habit of coexistence, and a habit of coexistence becomes attachment before anyone has a proper word for it. Still, the creature remained itself. It could vanish for hours. It could refuse contact. It could watch from a distance and return only when it wished. That independence never disappeared. It was precisely what made the bond so delicate and so powerful. People were not loving an obedient servant. They were learning to love a being that could always remain partly elsewhere. And that tension, gentle as it seems, is what would carry the cat into the next great turning of its history. Because once an animal becomes part of the emotional life of the house, people do not only make room for it on the floor, they begin making room for it in the mind, in symbol, and eventually, in reverence. And reverence always begins with attention. Before a creature is painted into meaning, it is simply watched. A cat beside a sleeping place, a cat in a storeroom, a cat slipping past a doorway at dusk. Over time, those repeated sights begin to gather weight. People notice what the animal does, yes, but also how it does it. The calm before the movement, the measured pause, the way it can seem perfectly at rest and fully alert at once. A house can grow used to that presence very quickly. Then, almost without realizing it, it begins to organize little feelings around it: trust, curiosity, comfort, even a touch of awe. That is how the next shift happens. Not because the cat changes its nature, but because human beings start reading that nature more deeply. Protecting food is useful. Guarding the edges of the night feels important. Being gentle with its young, yet exact with prey, begins to seem almost symbolic, whether anyone says so out loud or not. And once people start treating an animal as meaningful, it no longer lives only in corners and store places. It enters imagination. Its body becomes language. Its habits begin to stand for things larger than themselves: safety, household order, patience, alertness, the thin line between comfort and danger. You can feel this happening in a home long before anyone builds formal reverence around it. Someone notices that the room feels different when the cat is there. Someone else notices how quickly it hears what humans miss. Someone watches it emerge in evening light and feels, just for a second, that it belongs to an older rhythm than the people around it. None of this requires superstition at first. It comes naturally from living close to a creature that never stopped being itself. That is part of what makes the story of self-domestication so unusual. The cat entered our lives without becoming simple. And because it remained complex, it could hold many meanings at once. It could still be the hunter near grain, still be the quiet passenger on moving stores, still be the warm body in the corner of a room. But now, it could also become an emblem of the room itself, a sign that the house was protected, lived in, settled. The animal had begun as a solution to a practical problem. Now it was becoming something harder to measure and much more powerful in the long run. A bearer of atmosphere, a little keeper of order, moving silently through human space. This is where the bond becomes truly durable. Usefulness can start a relationship, but it does not always deepen it. Atmosphere does. Familiar presence does. The sense that a place feels more complete with this creature than without it. That changes how people remember home. And once an animal becomes tied to the feeling of home, it can survive changes in fashion, trade, language, even belief. It may be feared in one generation and cherished in another, but the memory of what it can offer never disappears entirely. Still, reverence is not a simple blessing. It raises the animal higher in the human mind, but it also makes it vulnerable to whatever stories the human mind tells next. A useful creature can be judged by results. A meaningful creature can be judged by fantasy. That is the danger hidden inside admiration. The more people invest a cat with symbolism, the less they may see the plain animal underneath. For now, though, the movement is upward, closer to the center of the house, closer to affection, closer to the sacred edge of thought. The same hunter that once waited near the first grain stores is no longer only tolerated or merely welcomed. It is becoming unforgettable. And the moment a creature becomes unforgettable, it is no longer carried only in boats or across thresholds. It is carried into belief. And belief can cradle a thing very gently, right before it turns and tests it. And once belief begins to gather around a creature, its place in the human world becomes much less simple. A hunter near stored food can be judged by what it prevents. A companion in the house can be judged by the calm it brings. But a meaningful animal, one that has been lifted into memory, symbol, and feeling, begins to carry far more than its own body. People look at the same quiet shape and see different things layered inside it. Protection, patience, watchfulness, independence, nearness without submission. All of those qualities had been there from the start, all the way back to the old bargain near grain. Now they were being noticed with a deeper kind of intensity. That intensity changes daily life. A cat is no longer only moving through the house, it is being read. If it settles near a sleeping place, that feels like trust. If it sits alert by a doorway, that feels like vigilance. If it vanishes into shadow and returns at dusk, that feels almost ceremonial, because repetition creates meaning in the human mind. The creature itself is simply following the same old instincts, yet human beings cannot help building patterns around what returns again and again. A thing seen every evening becomes part of the story a household tells itself about safety. And the cat is unusually well suited to that role, precisely because it never fully gives itself away. That is the paradox at the center of this history. The bond grows stronger by negotiating with distance. This animal does not offer total openness. It offers glimpses, a resting posture, a chosen nearness, a pause long enough for a hand to come close. Then perhaps it moves away again. That rhythm of approach and withdrawal gives the relationship its charge. People are living not only with usefulness now, they are living with mystery that has become familiar enough not to frighten them, at least not yet. If you think about it, that may be one reason the cat settled so deeply into the private atmosphere of human life. It left room for imagination. A fully transparent creature gives you comfort, perhaps, but little to wonder about. This one kept some inner distance, and that distance let people feel they were sharing space with something ancient and self-contained, wild in the sense of retained dignity, a being whose history had not been flattened by human control. And because it retained that dignity, the relationship could deepen without becoming ownership in the total sense. That is where the emotional bond becomes durable. The house does not merely use the cat. The house begins to orient around it in tiny ways. A space stays open. A certain quiet is preserved when it sleeps. Its return is noticed. Its absence is felt. None of this requires grand declarations. It happens through habit, and habits are how most long histories are built, especially the tender ones. Still, the more people valued this presence, the more sharply the next question would arise. What do you do with a creature you need, admire, and perhaps even love when it still refuses to become entirely legible? When its gaze remains unreadable for 1 second too long? When the same silence that soothed you yesterday begins, in a different mood or a different age, to feel like concealment? That is the danger now approaching this long relationship. Because once a cat has been welcomed into the emotional center of the home, the stakes of misunderstanding it become much higher. And human beings, as you know, are very capable of turning reverence into suspicion without changing the animal at all. And that turn can happen with frightening ease. A creature does not need to change for a culture to change around it. The same cat that once seemed like a blessing beside stored food can begin to seem unsettling if a society grows more anxious, more suspicious of what moves at night, more fearful of anything that keeps its own will. The body is unchanged. The habits are unchanged. It still slips through narrow spaces, still wakes at the smallest sound, still vanishes into shadow and reappears when it chooses. But now, those very same traits begin to collect a darker meaning. You feel how fragile this shift is. In a calm age, a cat's silence feels peaceful. In a fearful age, silence can feel secretive. In a practical household, sharp eyes are useful. In a tense one, those same eyes can seem to know too much. The animal itself has done nothing new. It is the human imagination that has changed its mood. And once imagination hardens into suspicion, old closeness can become strangely brittle. That is one of the saddest truths in this long history. The bond was built on mutual benefit, then warmed by familiarity, then deepened by affection and meaning. But meaning cuts both ways. When people begin to live inside stories of hidden danger, the cat becomes vulnerable precisely because it seemed half familiar and half untamed. A dog may be read as loyal. A grazing animal may be read as obedient. This one keeps too much of itself. Its face does not always reassure. Its movements are too quiet. Its timing belongs too much to dusk. And so the old mystery that once drew people closer can begin, in the wrong atmosphere, to push them away. If you imagine a dim room, a weak fire, a village already full of worry, you can see how quickly the mood turns. A cat appears in the doorway and pauses. It does what it does: waits, watches, listens. But the people watching it are no longer asking, will it keep the grain safe? They are asking other questions now. Why does it move like that? Why does it stare? Why does it appear when the house is quietest? Fear has a way of turning ordinary patterns into omens, and fear is especially dangerous when attached to something useful but independent. That independence had always been part of the bargain. It was the reason the relationship felt so alive. The cat was never fully absorbed into human command. It stayed near because the arrangement suited it. It rested in our spaces, without handing over its whole nature. In better times, that made the bond feel honest, even beautiful. In darker times, the same quality could be misread as refusal, secrecy, resistance to order. People often punish what they cannot fully explain. Still, even then, the creature kept doing what it had always done. It hunted where prey gathered. It slept where warmth could be found. It passed through human spaces with the same measured grace that had carried it from the Near East to storehouses, boats, homes, and hearts. That constancy matters. It reminds you that the story's real instability is not in the cat at all. It is in us, in the stories we tell when we are afraid. And that is where the chronicle now darkens. Because once suspicion takes hold, usefulness is not always enough to protect a creature. Affection is not always enough either. A society can depend on something and still turn against it. It can forget what kept its food safe. It can forget what quiet company once felt like. It can decide that the animal in the corner is no longer a companion, but a sign. The cat does not know this, of course. It cannot know that human beings are about to test the bond in one of the harshest ways possible. It only knows that night is coming again, and somewhere nearby, something small is moving in the walls. And when that test came, the deepest irony was almost too cruel to notice in the moment. The cat had entered human life because it solved a problem. That was the first bargain. Grain drew rodents. Rodents drew the hunter. And the hunter helped keep precious stores safer. Everything else came later. Familiarity, warmth, symbolism, affection. So when fear began to cloud human judgment, people were not turning against a decorative companion alone. They were turning against one of the oldest quiet helpers they had ever had. One that had stood beside human survival from the moment settled life created the right kind of invitation. But frightened societies are not very good at remembering practical gratitude. Once suspicion hardens, memory becomes selective. The room no longer remembers fewer ruined stores. The household no longer remembers the comfort of a known shape near the doorway at dusk. Instead, attention narrows around the details that can be made to feel ominous. The soundless steps, the night activity, the unreadable stare, the refusal to behave like a perfectly obedient animal. What had once felt dignified now feels aloof. What had once felt watchful now feels intrusive. It is the same body, the same habits, the same old inheritance from that Near Eastern wildcat, but seen through a mind already leaning toward dread. And that shift has consequences, even when nobody plans them. If fewer cats are allowed to remain near homes, the older balance begins to fray. The animal withdraws from the center of human life and survives where it can, in edges, barns, cellars, outbuildings, half-welcome places. It keeps hunting because hunting is what it does. But the closer, more trusting version of the arrangement becomes weaker. And when that happens, something else quietly regains ground. The small intruders in walls and stores do not care whether humans have grown suspicious of their old ally. They only care whether anything is still waiting for them at night. This is the sorrow inside the middle of the story. The cat remains useful even while being misunderstood. It remains capable even while being distrusted. It continues doing the very work that first brought it into our orbit. And yet the human imagination, once upset, can fail to see that work at all. That may be one of the loneliest things about this animal's history. Again and again, it offered benefit without requiring applause. And because it was quiet, people could forget. Picture one of those long nights. A store place, a beam of weak lamplight, a little movement in the wall. Somewhere nearby, a cat is still listening, still waiting, still perfectly built for this task. Yet the room's mood has changed. The old companion is not being read as part of the home's protection. It has become uncertain in human eyes. And uncertainty makes people careless with what once mattered most. Still, the bond does not break completely. It never does. That is important. Even in colder periods, even when fear distorts the relationship, the practical truth underneath remains stubbornly alive. People still need food protected. They still need their homes defended against the same small raiders that first opened the door to this partnership. And the creature itself has not forgotten anything. It does not need teaching, it does not need persuading. Give it a crack in the wall, a sound in the straw, a trace of movement by grain, and the ancient pattern wakes at once. Which means this was never going to be the end of the story. Human beings could burden the cat with bad meaning. They could push it outward, misread it, grow uneasy with its nature. But they could not erase the fact that it remained one of the most efficient answers to a problem they still had. And sooner or later, necessity has a way of cutting through fantasy. The question was not whether the old bargain would return. The question was how long people would keep blaming the creature in the corner before they noticed what was once again multiplying in the walls. And in the end, necessity did begin to speak louder than fear. It came unevenly, not in some neat, clean correction. Human beings rarely reverse themselves that gracefully. But the old practical truth kept pressing in from the edges of daily life. Food still had to be stored. Homes still had to be defended from the same quick little intruders that had first drawn the wildcat toward us in the Near East. A frightened story about cats could spread through a culture, yes. But a rat in the grain did not care about stories. A scratching sound in the wall could undo a great deal of superstition very quickly. So the bond endured in a humbler form. Even when the cat was pushed outward in imagination, it often remained inward in practice. It stayed in barns, near cellars, close to storerooms, in the quiet places where human need and animal skill still met without much ceremony. That is something I find almost moving. The relationship did not survive only because people were always wise or kind. Sometimes it survived because reality refused to cooperate with fear. The creature kept being useful. The old bargain kept proving itself, again and again. And while one part of the world grew uneasy with the cat's independence, another part kept a steadier memory of what this animal was. That matters more than it may seem. The story was never unfolding in only one place, under one mood, or under one set of beliefs. In some regions, the cat's place beside people remained much warmer. In the Islamic world, for example, affection toward cats endured far more openly. Their presence near homes and shared spaces did not have to carry the same shadow of suspicion. The animal could still be read as clean, useful, companionable, and worthy of care. That alternate memory became a kind of shelter in history, proof that the bond had not been broken everywhere, only distorted in certain times and places. You can feel the difference in the atmosphere. In one setting, a cat near a doorway is an omen. In another, it is simply at home. In one room, those quiet paws raise tension. In another, they barely interrupt the peace. The body has not changed. The old inheritance has not changed. Only the human reading of it has. And that is why this stretch of the story matters so much. It reminds you that the cat did not become blessed or cursed. It remained itself while cultures took turns deciding what that self meant. There is a strange dignity in that. Through all the swings of human feeling, usefulness, affection, reverence, fear, the cat kept the same core nature. It still moved between our spaces and its own instincts with remarkable ease. It still accepted shelter without surrendering identity. That may be why the bond was able to recover. A creature entirely remade by human control might have been lost when opinion turned against it. But this one retained enough independence to survive our confusion. So little by little, the image began to soften again. Because all superstition did not vanish overnight. It never does. Old fears leave stains. They linger in sayings, glances, little hesitations passed from one generation to another. But everyday experience has a patient way of wearing those fears down. A cat seen keeping watch near stored food is harder to demonize. A calm body dozing by the hearth is harder to treat as a threat forever. A familiar creature returning each evening, doing what it has always done, can slowly restore trust where panic once lived. And once trust begins to return, admiration is never very far behind. Because people do not simply go back to seeing a useful mouser. They start seeing the elegance again, the restraint, the composure, the strange comfort of sharing space with a being that remains slightly outside your control. That quality, which once made the cat vulnerable to fear, will now make it newly attractive in a changing world. A different age is coming, one with parlors, private rooms, quieter interiors, and people who will begin to prize not just utility, but presence. And in that new world, the cat will not merely survive our misunderstanding, it will become fashionable. And fashionable is not the same thing as fully understood. When the cat begins to enter more polished interiors, something subtle changes again. The old working spaces do not vanish. Grain still needs guarding, walls still hide small intruders, and barns do not stop being useful territory. But now the creature is also welcomed into rooms where usefulness is no longer the whole story. You can picture it easily. A quieter house, thicker fabrics, fire-warmed corners, chairs no one sits in for hours, windows catching pale afternoon light. In a place like that, a cat does not only solve a problem, it completes a scene. That is a very different kind of power. For thousands of years, this animal survived by making itself relevant to human needs. Now it begins to succeed for another reason too, because people discover that its presence suits a certain idea of refinement. The still posture, the careful movements, the way it can occupy a room without disturbing it. All of that starts to feel elegant. A dog may fill space with devotion. A cat shapes it with restraint. And in a more settled domestic world, restraint can become deeply attractive. So the creature moves inward again, but in a new register. More than the keeper of stores now, more than the tolerated hunter in the corner, it becomes part of taste, part of atmosphere, part of what a home says about itself. A room with a cat in it seems composed in a way that is hard to explain. The animal lends grace without trying. It rests in a shaft of sun, and suddenly the room looks finished. It steps silently across a rug, and even its distance feels stylish. People begin to admire what once made them uneasy: the independence, the selectiveness, the refusal to flatter too easily. This is one of the great reversals in the story. The very trait that could trigger suspicion in darker times now becomes part of the appeal. A cat does not plead. It does not perform obedience for approval. It appears where it wishes, settles where it pleases, and seems to judge the household by standards entirely its own. In a world that is learning to prize private comfort and cultivated interiors, that self-possession becomes almost luxurious. Yet the old truth remains underneath. Even on a cushioned chair, the cat is still the descendant of the hunter that approached human stores by choice. The body has not been remade into helplessness. The instincts have not been erased. This is why the story never becomes one of complete transformation. You can place the creature beside polished furniture, beside folded blankets, beside a hearth, and still, if something tiny moves behind a wall, the old machinery wakes instantly. The same focus returns, the same patience, the same ancient readiness. And perhaps that is what makes this stage of the bond so compelling. People are no longer keeping the cat only because they need a worker. They are learning to love a presence that carries both beauty and usefulness at once. A creature can rest in softness all day and still remain capable. It can look ornamental without ever becoming fake. It can fit the house while still belonging, in some quiet way, to older landscapes and older hungers. That tension gives it a special glamour. You are looking at wild competence made comfortable. Of course, once people begin admiring an animal this way, another change follows close behind. Admiration leads to comparison. Comparison leads to preference. Preference, eventually, leads to selection. Not the first great selection that made the bond. That happened long ago through proximity and tolerance, but a new, more deliberate human habit of noticing coats, forms, temperaments, and types. A practical ally is becoming an object of organized attention. And the moment people start asking, does this cat belong here? And also, what kind of cat is this? The next chapter has already begun. And once people begin asking what kind of cat they are looking at, they also begin revealing something important about themselves. For a very long time, the relationship had been built on function first and feeling second. The creature hunted, guarded, watched, settled, and slowly became part of the emotional weather of the home. But now, a new human impulse starts pressing in. The urge to sort, compare, admire, and define. One cat seems finer-boned. Another seems calmer. One has a coat people linger over. Another carries itself with a look that feels especially noble or soft or elegant. The gaze that once asked, will this animal keep the stores safe, now begins asking, what makes this one distinct? That sounds small, but it changes the texture of the bond. When people begin noticing difference so closely, they are not just living beside the cat. They are studying it as an object of taste. And yet, this is where the story becomes especially interesting, because even with all that human attention, the animal does not transform in the sweeping way some others did. Dogs, horses, cattle, those relationships led to deep, deliberate reshaping over time. Bodies changed, roles changed, temperaments were pushed and pulled hard by human need. The cat, even under closer scrutiny, resists that total remaking. That resistance shows in the body itself. Put the animal on a cushioned chair in a neatly kept room under human admiration, and still it moves like the old hunter. The shoulders gather in the same way. The paws still land with the same care. The ears still turn first. The pause before motion is still the pause of a predator reading the world. Human beings may admire different coats, different expressions, different temperaments, but underneath all that, the creature keeps returning to its original design with remarkable stubbornness. That is among the clearest signs that this was never an ordinary domestication story. The cat entered human life by choosing a niche, not by surrendering itself to total redesign. That older pattern still holds, even as people become more possessive in their admiration. They can prefer one look over another. They can encourage certain traits, make room for certain temperaments, speak of elegance, beauty, rarity, or charm. But the deep structure remains astonishingly intact. The animal does not become helpless. It does not become dependent in the way a fully remade creature might. It stays competent. It stays legible to the old world of hunting, waiting, listening, and striking. Maybe that's why the cat keeps its dignity so easily, even in luxury. A pampered animal can sometimes lose the aura of its origins. This one rarely does. A cat stretched across a soft blanket still looks like it could rise and understand the dark. A cat sleeping by a window still seems connected to things beyond the glass. That is part of its hold on people. We are not only admiring softness, we are admiring contained ability, the sense that something ancient and self-directed has agreed, for now, to share our domestic space. And because of that, the human response grows more layered. Some people are drawn to the beauty, some to the calm, some to the independence, some, perhaps without admitting it, to the little thrill of living beside a creature that has never fully become ours. That feeling matters. It keeps the bond from becoming dull. You are not only keeping company with habit, you are living beside retained wildness, carefully folded into household life. But there is one even stranger adaptation still sitting quietly inside this relationship, and most people hear it every day without realizing what it means. Because for all the ways the cat refused to become fully remade, it did make one intimate adjustment to human life. Not in its bones, not in its claws, not in its hunting body, but in its voice. And that little adjustment in the voice may be one of the most intimate clues in the entire relationship. If you listen carefully to a cat in a quiet house, you notice something odd almost at once. The sound is directed. A short call from the hallway, a sharper one by the food place, a softer one near a closed door. It rarely feels random. It feels aimed at you. And that is because, in a very real sense, it is. Adult wildcats almost never meow to each other. That call belongs mostly to kittens, a small voice used to draw attention, to ask, to keep contact with a mother. But house cats carried that sound into adulthood and turned it toward human beings. That is an extraordinary thing, because it reveals the kind of domestication this was. The cat did not become more obedient in the grand, obvious way some other animals did. It did something subtler. It found a signal that worked on us. It kept a youthful call and redirected it across species. In other words, this animal learned that human beings respond to certain sounds, and it kept using one that opens our attention almost instantly. Once you hear that fact, you can never hear a meow quite the same way again. That sound from the kitchen at dawn, that questioning little note from the foot of the bed, that complaint outside a door you forgot to leave open. None of it is merely noise. It is history speaking in a very small voice. A wild hunter from the old line of Felis silvestris lybica did not give up its predatory body, did not surrender its independence, did not let human beings reshape it beyond recognition. Instead, it discovered a pressure point in us. It learned how to ask. And perhaps ask is too gentle a word sometimes, because anyone who has lived with a cat knows how effective that sound can be. It can be sweet, yes. It can also be insistent, theatrical, almost impossible to ignore. The creature that once solved the rodent problem at the edge of settlement eventually figured out how to summon its oversized primate companion from the other room. That is not servitude. That is strategy. Tender strategy, perhaps, wrapped in a small voice, but strategy all the same. This is why the whole chronicle keeps circling back to the same surprising thought. We often imagine domestication as a one-way act, as if humans simply shape an animal and the story ends there. But with the cat, the shaping always ran both ways. We created the niche long ago with stored grain. The animal stepped into it by choice. Then, over centuries of sharing homes, it adjusted just enough to hold our attention more effectively. Not too much, never so much that it stopped being itself, just enough to live well with us. You can feel the elegance of that balance. The body stays ancient, the instincts stay sharp, the independence remains almost theatrical in its firmness. Yet the voice bends toward us. A private little bridge appears between species, not in the form of loyalty speeches or trained displays, but in a sound that says, in effect, "Look at me, now. I need something." And most of the time, we do. So the next time a cat calls from another room, you can hear more than a household habit in it. You can hear the strange success of this entire arrangement. A creature never fully remade by human hands found a way to make itself understood anyway. And once you admit that, a bigger question becomes impossible to avoid. If the cat learned how to use our homes, our warmth, our food systems, and even our instincts to care in response to its voice, then who exactly has been domesticating whom all this time? And once that question is asked honestly, the whole relationship starts to look a little different. For most of human history, we like to place ourselves at the center of every domestication story. We imagine that we choose, we shape, we improve, we command. That story fits many animals well enough. But with the cat, the picture keeps slipping out of our hands. Yes, we offered warmth, walls, stores of food, quieter sleeping places, and later, softer rooms. Yes, we made a world full of opportunities it could use. But the creature itself chose how far to come, how long to stay, and how much of its nature it was willing to bend. Not very much, as it turns out. That is the secret hiding in plain sight every time a cat ignores you for an hour, then appears beside you as if the timing were entirely its own. The bond was never built on obedience. It was built on selective cooperation. The animal accepted the arrangement where it worked, refused it where it did not, and kept enough distance to preserve its old competence. It did not stop being able to hunt. It did not stop being able to live inside its senses with remarkable precision. It did not trade away its identity just to remain near us. Perhaps that is exactly why we keep finding it so compelling. A fully dependent creature awakens one kind of care in us. A fully wild one awakens wonder from a distance. The cat sits in the strange middle ground. It allows intimacy without surrender. It gives affection, but in portions. It receives comfort, but without pretending it needs us every second. That balance can be oddly humbling. You are not simply the owner of such an animal. You are the accepted companion of one. It is a smaller role than many people imagine, and in some ways, a more beautiful one. If you think about your own life with a cat, or any cat you have known well, you can probably feel this truth in a very ordinary scene. You do not summon it like a machine. You wait for it sometimes. You adjust your posture because it has settled on your lap. You leave a door open because it dislikes being blocked. You learn which surface is theirs, even if you never agreed to that in words. Little by little, the household rearranges itself around this poised little being that supposedly belongs to us. That is accommodation. And the funny thing is, we often offer it gladly. We move the glass from the table edge. We keep a blanket folded in a favorite chair. We speak more softly when the animal is asleep. We answer its call from another room. We change our routines around feeding times and window spots and familiar evening habits. None of this means we are controlled in some silly total sense, but it does mean the influence runs both ways. The old hunter stepped into our world, and our world bent around it. Maybe that is what the 12,000-year history of cats and self-domestication really teaches better than almost any other human-animal story. Partnership does not always look like mastery. Sometimes it looks like being chosen by a creature that stays whole. Sometimes it looks like building a life around someone who never stops being slightly free. And that freedom never disappeared, not even when the cat came fully indoors. In fact, once human life changed again, once homes became tighter, cities taller, and daily life more enclosed, that ancient independence was about to face its strangest test yet. Because a hunter that once navigated fields, storerooms, boats, courtyards, and open thresholds would soon be asked to live inside walls almost all the time. And the question would no longer be whether the cat could adapt to us. It would be whether we could build a modern world that still made room for the wild little mind that had chosen us in the first place. And the modern world did try to make that room, though not without changing the terms of the old arrangement. Once human life moved upward into denser towns and more enclosed homes, the cat's daily map grew smaller. The old route from doorway to yard, from wall to grain store, from courtyard to field, could no longer be taken for granted. More and more often, the animal found itself living within tighter boundaries, stairs instead of open ground, windows instead of hedges, hallways instead of alleys. The shift was not only architectural, it was emotional too. A creature once valued partly for work in shared human spaces was becoming, more than ever, a constant companion inside private life. That change reveals something very tender about us. When the practical need grows less obvious, you discover what remains. If you no longer keep a cat mainly because mice threaten your food, then why keep one at all? The answer, for many people, is simple and profound. Because the house feels different with one in it. Quieter, but not empty. Still, but not lifeless. A cat on a windowsill. A cat crossing the floor at dusk. A cat settling into the same chair every evening. These things begin to anchor domestic time. The creature no longer protects only stored grain or cargo. It begins protecting atmosphere. You can hear that in the way people talk about them now, even when they do not realize they are doing it. They speak of routines built around feeding, around morning greetings, around the familiar sound of movement at night. They describe coming home to an animal that does not exactly welcome them like a dog would, and yet somehow restores the room simply by being there. The bond becomes less about labor and more about presence. And strangely enough, that may bring us closer to the truth of the relationship than some earlier ages ever did. Because now, without the old economic necessity in the foreground, you can see more clearly what the cat has always been offering. Something subtler than obedience, spectacle, or endless reassurance. Composure. Company without pressure. A little island of unforced being in the middle of human stress. The same independence that once made the animal useful around food and haunting in myth now becomes soothing in modern life. A cat does not demand that you keep performing. It sits nearby. It watches. It sleeps. It remains fully itself. And in a world that pulls human attention in 100 directions, that steadiness can feel almost medicinal. Yet none of this erased the older animal beneath the calmer domestic surface. If anything, indoor life made that old wiring easier to notice. A toy skittering across the floor still wakes the stalk and pounce sequence. A sound behind a cabinet still sharpens the ears and freezes the body into focus. The window becomes a safe hunting blind, the hallway a narrow patrol route, the edge of the bed a lookout point. Modern comfort did not replace the ancient design. It revealed how durable it was. Even surrounded by fabric, glass, and central heating, the cat continues to carry the timing of a hunter. That is why the relationship remains so compelling even now. You are not sharing your home with a decorative remnant of nature. You are sharing it with a functioning piece of nature that has learned over thousands of years how to live beside you without ceasing to be itself. The compromise is still visible everywhere, in the meow aimed at human ears, in the untouched efficiency of the body, in the way the animal can be deeply relaxed and instantly alert in the same afternoon. But once the cat became a constant presence in enclosed human life, another question rose that earlier ages did not have to face so sharply. What happens when a highly skilled little predator lives this close to us, this safely, this successfully, in a world where the rest of the living landscape is shrinking? Because now the old bargain is about to become an ethical one. And an ethical bargain is always harder than a practical one. When the first wildcats edged toward human stores, the arrangement was simple. We had made a place full of prey. They took advantage of it. We benefited too. But in the modern world, the same skill that once protected our grain can create new problems in landscapes already under strain. The cat is still doing what it was shaped to do. Notice movement, stalk quietly, strike fast. The difference is that now the world around it is crowded with human changes, fragile habitats, and fewer safe margins for small creatures living outside our walls. That is the uncomfortable part of love, isn't it? Truly loving an animal means looking at its gifts and its costs at the same time. A cat outdoors is not pretending when it hunts. It is not being cruel. It is not misbehaving. It is being exactly what 12,000 years of this story have shown it to be, an efficient little predator with an ancient body and a modern address. Even a well-fed one may still chase, catch, and kill. Hunger is not the only engine. Pattern is. Instinct is. The same old circuitry that once made the first bargain so successful can now press against the balance of birds, small mammals, reptiles, and other animals living close to human neighborhoods. So the question changes again. It is no longer just, how did the cat come to live with us? It becomes, how do we live responsibly with a creature like this now? And that is not a cold question. It comes from affection. If anything, it comes from finally taking the cat's true nature seriously. Too many people want the comfort of imagining their little companion as harmless softness with whiskers. But that was never the truth. The softness is real, yes. So is the hunter. You can probably see both sides of it in a single afternoon. A cat sleeping belly up in a stripe of sun. Then 10 minutes later, body low, eyes fixed, tail twitching at a flicker beyond the window. Same animal. Same old inheritance. So responsible care matters so much now. We cannot love the gentle parts and deny the capable ones. We have to make room for both in how we build daily life. For some people, that means richer indoor lives, climbing spaces, play, routine, windows, hunting games redirected into toys and movement. For others, it means protected outdoor access, enclosed gardens, careful choices that let the animal feel air and light without turning the local landscape into an open hunting ground. None of these answers is perfect. But perfection was never the point. The point is honesty. A cat needs stimulation, safety, and respect for what it is. The wider world needs consideration too. And then there is the other modern wound, the animals with no stable home at all. A cat without care does not become romantic merely because it is free. it becomes vulnerable to hunger, illness, weather, accidents, and relentless breeding. The same successful body that adapted so well to human-made spaces can suffer badly when abandoned to their edges. So responsibility now runs in two directions at once: toward the wildlife affected by feline hunting, and toward the cats themselves, whose welfare depends on whether humans are willing to be thoughtful, not merely sentimental. In a strange way, this brings the whole history back into focus. From the beginning, the relationship worked best when both sides benefited and neither side was misunderstood. The wildcat came closer because the niche made sense. People kept allowing that closeness because it solved real problems. Now, we have to become worthy partners again, not by pretending the cat is something it is not, but by making wiser space for what it has always been. And that wiser space demands one last, difficult kind of maturity from us. We have to admit that the creature on the windowsill is not only a comfort, not only a companion, not only a survivor from deep history. It is also a responsibility that reveals what kind of humans we have become. And that responsibility may be the most revealing chapter of all. For thousands of years, the cat showed us what it was, plainly and consistently: a hunter, a companion, a creature willing to live beside us without handing over its nature. The real question now is whether we are willing to be just as honest in return. Can we love an animal without pretending it is simpler than it is? Can we care for it deeply while still seeing the rest of the living world around it? That is a question not just about pets, but about maturity, because the modern bond asks more of us than the first one did. In the beginning, the arrangement was almost effortless. We stored grain, rodents gathered, wildcats came close, and both sides benefited. But now we manage food, shelter, health, safety, breeding, space, and sometimes even emotional life for animals that depend on our choices far more than their earliest ancestors ever did. We have taken the old, loose partnership and pulled it inward until it lives in our kitchens, on our beds, by our windows, in our routines. Once you bring a creature that close, you cannot shrug off responsibility as if it were still only passing through the edge of camp. And yet, the cat still reminds us, every day, that closeness does not erase otherness. You can see it in the way it watches an empty corner, as if listening to something beyond your hearing. In the sudden intensity when a small insect crosses the floor. In the way a sleeping body can become a coiled hunter in a breath. The house may belong to human schedules, but the cat keeps a second clock running underneath it. Older, quieter, built from dusk, movement, scent, and patience. That second clock is part of what people love. It makes the domestic world feel connected to something larger than itself. Maybe that is why cats remain such powerful companions in modern life. Not only because they are soft, beautiful, or soothing, though they are all those things, but because they carry a piece of uncompromised nature into spaces that might otherwise feel too controlled, too sealed, too fully human. A room with a cat in it contains more than furniture and routine. It contains attention, instinct, pause, a kind of elegant refusal to become entirely mechanical. And if you think about it, that may be part of what they have been giving us all along. In the first settlement, they protected our food. Later, they protected our sense of home. In quieter centuries, they gave atmosphere to rooms. In anxious ones, they survived our misunderstandings. In the modern house, they often give something even less tangible and more precious. A living presence that asks us to notice the pace of another mind, to watch more carefully, to speak more softly. to accept affection that arrives by choice instead of command. That is no small gift. It may even explain why the bond feels so enduring. So many human arrangements are built on control, speed, and visible usefulness. This one was never fully like that. The cat stayed because the arrangement worked. Then it stayed because the home offered warmth and safety. Then it stayed because somehow, over many generations, a genuine closeness formed without either side losing itself entirely. That is rarer than we admit. So when you look at the modern cat, resting on a radiator, perched on a windowsill, calling from another room in that old kitten voice repurposed for human ears, you're looking at an animal that has crossed an astonishing stretch of time without surrendering its core. Few creatures have managed that so well. Fewer still have made us love them for it. And that brings us almost to the final quiet turn in the story. Because once you understand what this creature has carried through all these centuries, the old body, the old instincts, the chosen closeness, the little adaptations that let it live so well beside us, one last scene begins to change shape. It is not in a temple, or a port, or a storehouse. It is in the dark room where you first heard the bed settle. And that bed settling in the dark means something very different once you have carried the whole story this far. At the beginning, it was only a sensation, a little weight, a shift in the blanket, a warm presence choosing a place near you. Now it carries 12,000 years inside it. Not as a grand speech, not as a museum plaque, but as something quieter and stranger. The body settling there is the descendant of a hunter that once stood at the edge of human light and made a calculation. There was grain, there were rodents, there was risk, and there was opportunity. From that single kind of choice, repeated across generations, came the entire intimacy of the modern room. That is why this history never really belongs only to the past. It is still happening every day in miniature. Every time a cat chooses the windowsill instead of the floor, chooses your chair instead of an empty one, chooses to call from the hallway because it knows you will answer, that old pattern continues. The animal is still reading your world for advantage, safety, comfort, and routine. And you, in turn, are still making room. You still arrange warmth, food, rest, and attention around a creature that never quite stopped being its own small nation. There is something deeply human in that arrangement. We often imagine love as the softening of difference, as the slow merging of lives until everything becomes mutual and transparent. But the cat has always resisted that kind of neatness. It does not erase the line between itself and you. It crosses it, yes. It curls beside you, sleeps in your house, shapes your habits, sometimes stares at you with sleepy trust. But it keeps an inward room that belongs only to itself. And somehow, instead of weakening the bond, that preserved interior may be the very thing that gives the bond its power. Because being chosen by a free creature feels different from owning a compliant one. That may be the truest emotional thread running through the whole long chronicle. From the first stores of grain in the Fertile Crescent to the enclosed quiet of the modern bedroom, the cat kept offering a relationship that was real without being absolute. It accepted us in degrees. It adapted to us selectively. It made use of what we built, but did not dissolve into it. Even its most domestic gestures carry that old independence. A cat sleeps near you because it wants to, not because history erased every alternative from its body. Perhaps that is why so many people feel the presence of a cat so strongly, even in silence. A dog may fill a room with enthusiasm. A cat often fills it with awareness. A room with one resting in it feels observed, inhabited, claimed in a measured and ancient way. The air changes. Time slows a little. The human world, with all its noise and plans and devices, is suddenly sharing space with another rhythm, one built from dusk, waiting, warmth, and the clean certainty of instinct. That rhythm has survived villages, ships, cities, fear, admiration, fashion, and modern domestic life without disappearing. So when you hear that familiar movement again tonight, it will not only be the sound of a pet coming close, it will also be the echo of the first bargain. The old hunter at the edge of the store place, the carried companion in Cyprus, the silent traveler on moving grain, the watcher in the doorway, the elegant presence in the room, the animal that never fully surrendered and yet somehow stayed. And that leaves us with one last gentle thought before the final, quiet landing. If the cat beside you is still, in some deep sense, that same ancient creature, then what exactly is it seeing when it looks back at you in the dark? And perhaps the answer is simpler and stranger than we expect. When a cat looks at you in the dark, it is probably seeing a familiar, large creature inside a well-mapped territory, a source of warmth, a source of food, a moving part of the home's rhythm, a being whose habits can be predicted, influenced, and, on good days, gently managed. That may sound almost insulting if you are hoping for flattery, but I think it is actually one of the sweetest truths in the whole story. The cat does not stay because it has been fooled into obedience. It stays because, in its own quiet way, you have become part of a workable world. That is an extraordinary form of trust. The trust of a cat is thinner, finer, more deliberate. It is built from repeated proof. You close the door softly. You fill the bowl. You return at expected times. You make space on the bed. You do not move too roughly when it sleeps beside you. Over time, the animal's old caution loosens one thread at a time, and you are allowed deeper into its circle of calm. If you think about the ancient wildcat behind all this, that permission is almost astonishing. And yet, the permission is never total. That is the part people still wrestle with, even after all these centuries. We want a clear answer to the bond. Does the cat love us, need us, use us, trust us? The honest answer is probably yes, in overlapping ways that do not fit neatly into human categories. This creature did not enter our lives to become a furry version of ourselves. It entered because our world offered advantages. Then, over a vast stretch of time, the arrangement thickened into familiarity, affection, communication, and something like companionship, but without ever losing the original realism beneath it. Maybe that realism is what makes the bond so durable. A cat does not promise what it cannot give. It gives presence when it chooses. It gives nearness when the conditions feel right. It gives the sound of contentment, the press of a body at your feet, the soft weight that settles onto a blanket and tells you that, for now, this shared shelter is acceptable. There is a humility in accepting love on those terms. You stop asking for a performance. You start learning to recognize smaller gifts, the slow blink, the chosen lap, the quiet return after wandering the house on invisible errands. Seen that way, the whole long history feels less like conquest and more like negotiation that became intimacy. From the first drawn rodents near stored grain, to the burial in Cyprus, to shipholds, hearths, parlors, and modern apartments, the same principle kept repeating. The cat came close where closeness made sense. Humans welcomed it where welcome made life better. Neither side fully dissolved into the other, and somehow, precisely because of that, the relationship stayed alive. It survived misunderstanding, changing homes, changing beliefs, and changing worlds. Which brings you right back to the dark room. Because now the final question is personal. After everything this animal has carried, the old hunting body, the selective trust, the little adapted voice meant for human ears, the refusal to become anything less than itself, what does it mean that tonight, out of all the warm places it could have chosen, it chose the space beside you? The answer to that is waiting in the sound you hear next, the one that turns 12,000 years of history into something you can feel in your own chest. And now, when the room has gone quiet again, the answer is no longer abstract at all. The cat beside you is seeing a place that has held, for one more night, a safe patch of fabric, a body that does not strike, a warmth worth borrowing, a pattern that has remained reliable long enough to become part of its map of the world. That may sound modest compared with the grand words people use for love, but modest things are often the ones that last. A bowl filled when expected, a hand that pauses instead of grabbing, a lamp switched off, a blanket dented by a small turning body. This is how a 12,000-year story survives. Not in monuments, but in repeated acts so ordinary they hardly seem like history at all. That is the true ending of the long journey. The 12,000-year history of cats and self-domestication arrives here instead, in a compromise so old it feels natural, not a triumph where one side conquers the other, or a neat tale of taming. We built stores, walls, doors, windows, routines. The creature entered that world because it offered prey, shelter, and warmth. Then it stayed long enough for something rarer to happen. Utility softened into familiarity. Familiarity thickened into trust. Trust never became ownership, and perhaps that is why it endured. The cat did not lay down its ancient self to be loved. It kept it, and was loved anyway. There is a kind of grace in that. A lot of human relationships are built on demands to become easier, simpler, more manageable. This one never was. The animal remained selective, alert, private, difficult to flatter into false devotion. It asked us to live with a being that cannot be fully possessed, only welcomed. And over thousands of years, we kept making room. We left spaces by hearths and storerooms, on shipboards and windowsills, at the foot of beds and in the bend of our days. In return, the cat gave what it chose to give: watchfulness, beauty, the old little voice meant for our ears, the calm of a body resting without fear. If you want the whole history in one image, it might be this. In the middle of the night, the blanket dips slightly, then goes still. That is all. No speech, no ceremony. Just the weight of a hunter from the edge of the first granaries settling into the curve of a human life, as if the distance between those two worlds had always been crossable. And maybe that is the wisdom hidden in the story. The oldest bonds are not always forged by force or perfected by control. Sometimes they are made by two different lives learning, very slowly, exactly how near they can come without either one disappearing. After a while, the purr lowers and evens out. The room does not get larger, but it feels less empty. On the chair, on the windowsill, on the bed beside you, a small shape has folded itself into sleep, and the dark seems arranged around it. If you'd like, leave a note with the name of the cat who has shared your nights. And subscribe if you want me to tell you another long story when the house goes quiet again.